Okay, welcome students to week 2 of Introduction to Political Science. I'm Professor Callahan, and again, as you know, and this week we're going to learn about politics in the state. We're going to go over some ideologies and how those ideologies play a part in the construction of the state. And so when we talk in politics, when we talk about state, we're talking about the government, the country itself as a whole. Sometimes we tend to look at when we say state, some people think you're talking about California as a state. No, we're talking about nation states and how they construct their form of governments and how the government, how their ideologies play a part in the day-to-day functions of their countries. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start. And the first thing I wanted to go over is what is the state? So when you say what is the state, Max Weber, he was a German, we call it political philosopher, said that the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So what he is saying is that the state itself, when we're talking about the state and the state through legitimate force, that means and in our state, in our government, we have law enforcement, we have at a federal level, which also are law enforcement, we have security agencies, and their job, they do kind of keep us in line. And the goal is to make sure we're good citizens, being good citizens. And now, is everybody a good citizen? No. In some cases, some people tend to not be good citizens because they tend to know, and I want to be careful how I word this, but some people make choices. Some of it's due to environment where they live and not having access. Some people are just not good people. And so when you're not a good person, and you tend to fall outside of the being a good citizen. And when you're not a good citizen, then that's when if you get caught, end up being put away. When we talk about sovereignty, the highest form of authority is within a given territory. If you look at the situation in Ukraine right now, the issue is Russia invaded a sovereign nation. This is why the United States is not on the side of Russia. And so, for not just the United States and the West, right? Now, China's kind of playing trying to play the middle game, because for China, it's about money. It's about keeping the economy going. But with some countries, South Africa too, South Africa has come down on the side of Russia, but they did say, the South African president did say, because South Africa, Russia, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China belongs to this economic cooperation called BRICS. And BRICS is having their meeting in South Africa, and they posed the question to the South African president because Putin has an arrest warrant. And he said, Putin is a friend, but if he comes to South Africa, because we have signed this agreement through the world court system, that if Putin comes into South Africa, flies into Johannesburg, which is the capital, he could be arrested, and there's nothing the South African government can do to protect him. Now, he has stated he is kind of just staying out of this situation in Ukraine due to that. But what African countries, now South Africa maybe not so much as other African nations, pretty much get their grain from Ukraine. And so Ukraine is kind of very important to the economic and the health of the people of a lot of African countries. But South Africa tends to be a little more wealthier. Nigeria and South Africa, Kenya tend to be economically a little more wealthier than most African nations. So they can they can pick and choose whose side they want to be on in this war between Russia and Ukraine. But remember, the issues about sovereignty, the authority that people have over themselves through their government in any given territory. However, we must also consider failed states. So you can't forget failed states. The Soviet Union was a failed state. Yugoslavia, a failed state because it no longer exists. And these are countries that existed prior to 1990. And so, yeah, so when we talk about a state, some states exist today, others don't. But you got to remember, if you go back 40, 50 years, there's some states that didn't exist. If you go back to 250 years, the United States wouldn't exist. So some nations, when we talk about sovereignty, as long as they exist, some people argue that Libya today is a failed state, even though it still has a national government, but it's pretty much run by tribes and clans at this point. When we talk about the typology of states, meaning basically it's when the state is, we call it the night watchman or the minimal state. The government concentrates on ensuring law and order. If you go back to when you go back to the Ottoman Empire is a good example of a night watchman minimal state, because when you go back to and look at the Ottoman Empire pretty much ran on, the Ottoman Empire had a very diverse group of people. They had diverse religions, diverse ethnicities. And as long as the Sultan got his taxes, you could, in the Ottoman Empire, worship any god you want. Now, if you fast forward to today and go into Iran, which is not just run by Shias or Muslims, but you have the Baha'i, you have Sunni Muslims, and actually the Baha'i is probably religiously persecuted more than any other group in Iran today. So when we talk about these night watchmen, the typology of states, we're talking about how states classify themselves, the classification, the categorization of the state itself, and how, when the government is just in the business, like the Ottoman Empire, of just making sure there's law and order. So then when we look back, and a lot of times when I would go to church, when I was going to church, when I was younger, a lot of times when I would always hear my pastor say, what's going on in Jerusalem has been going on for thousands of years, the Muslims versus the Jewish people. But once I did my history, looked into history, really, the Muslims and the Jewish people under the Ottoman Empire, under the Ottoman Sultan, pretty much, it was very peaceful. These wars didn't start until after World War II and finding the Jewish people a homeland. So a lot of times when we hear things, it tends to not always be rooted in factual truth, okay? Developmental state government act in partnership with private industry to ensure rapid economic growth. Development, we see this a lot. In the United States, we see a system where government works in partnership with private industry, and it's what keeps the capitalistic engine going. If you look at most companies, Elon Musk took out a government loan for Tesla. Government likes to give loans to private industry because the goal in the United States is not for the government to be involved in private industry. Now, there has been times throughout history where government had to get involved, like as just back in 2008, 2009, when the housing market crashed and government had to get involved in banking, then the car companies, and government had to get involved in Detroit, where the three car companies were located. And so sometimes in the United States, government has to get involved, but for the most part, government keeps its hands off of industry. Some people would argue, except for postal, but I agree that government should be involved in the postal service, because when government is not involved, the postal service is the only entity that has the infrastructure to deliver mail pretty much to everybody. And when they can't get to people, they outsource it to small businesses who will be the postal service in their community. DHL, UPS, FedEx, they don't have the infrastructure. There's some places these entities in the United States will not go. Okay, social democratic state tries to ensure goals such as equality of opportunity through state intervention in areas like education. The United States is a social democratic state. And when we say democratic, and we're talking about liberal democracy, we're not talking about Democrats and Republicans. Okay, we're talking about liberal with a small L, democracy, also with a small d, okay? Because the United States is both a democracy and a republic. And I'm gonna constantly say that throughout this course, because there are people out there who tend to believe that the United States is a republic only, and that is not true. That is misinformation. Okay, so just make sure you understand that the United States is a multi form of, it's multiple things in one, okay? We are a capitalistic society, but we do have some socialism. I mean, we do. I mean, just look at the military. The VA is very socialistic. Medicare is also socialistic. Those are socialistic institutions within our system, within our capitalistic system of government. Illiberal democracies, elections are held, but usually not meaningful. And the state does not prioritize guaranteeing rights and liberties. So Malaysia is a good example. Malaysia is a very unique country because Malaysia has, I believe, nine kind of kings over different parts of the country, and they form Malaysia, and they vote for who will be king over the whole entire country every 5 years. Okay, it's very unique, but the goal is not to necessarily prioritize the rights and liberties of the people. And usually when you have a monarchy that is somewhat absolute, you will find, and Malaysia has a prime minister, but the kings of these territories within Malaysia have a lot of power and a lot of say-so. Okay, and I would argue that it's probably a hard country to govern, to keep everybody happy. Authoritarian states, elections are not free or fair. Opposition parties are either banned or subjected to severe limitations, or they don't exist. And you know, sometimes, like Russia tends, if they don't align with Putin, then they are not going to exist. Then you have one-party states. Elections only occur between candidates from the same party. The state and the government are indistinguishable. Yes, and I would argue because China tends to have a lot of billionaires, China does have a lot of billionaires. In order for them to be billionaires, they got to be members of the Communist Party. You will not do well in China if you're not a member of the Communist Party. And then you have totalitarian states. The government tries to extinguish all sources of opposition and control the whole society. That's where you get North Korea. The Kim family has pretty much the only real dynasty through a totalitarian state, but they've done it through the cult personality of this one family. They make a deity of the male members of this family. The father, Kim Il-sung, the son, Kim Jong-il, and then the grandson, Kim Jong-un. These men, I don't want to say gentlemen, but these individuals are very, they're made into deities, human, like gods who walk the earth. And the people worship these entities, these people, these flawed people. When we talk about theories of the state, we talk about pluralism. When we talk about pluralism, pluralism is the society comprises of numerous groups, all which compete freely and fairly for the attention of impartial governments. No one group holds dominant positions. Okay, different groups are influential in different policy areas. Neo-pluralism. Now, when we talk about the classical version of pluralism, that's in theory. I want to argue that in practice, even though it can be a classical version, yeah, some groups have more sway than others. They just do. I mean, let's think about it. Right now, you have upwards of 70% of the US population arguing for some sort of federal gun regulation. And the NRA, you know, has more sway than, I would argue, than families that have lost loved ones to gun violence. Okay, regardless if it's mass shootings or just, you know, local gang violence. So sometimes groups, so this idea that everything's free and fair, I disagree with that. I don't always think things are necessarily free and fair. Some groups are more advantaged, and that's where the neo-pluralism comes in than others. So competition is not entirely free and fair. Governments are not neutral umpires. They have their own interests. And I agree. Sometimes government will do things based on the idea that for the sake of national security, we're going to do this. The problem with that, and I push back against all this, is that sometimes government, even our government, will sacrifice the lives of other people and sovereign nations for the national security of the United States. And, you know, which will then give rise to what we deem terrorism, what we call terrorism, on us when it's directed at us, right? But if you talk to people in the Middle East, maybe Iraq or Afghanistan, they would argue something different, and they would be right. They would have that right to do that because that's their perception of, and not perception, that's their lived experience, which we have no idea. When we talk about these two versions, they're very important to the liberal democratic theory, and neo-pluralism can be seen as a more realistic than classical version, and it's important to understand that, because we don't live in a society, and I know we like to think that with America, with the United States, is that we live in this country that's free and fair to everybody, and that's not always true. Okay, and so we're going to still look at some little more pluralism. So when we talk about pluralism in the basic form, it asserts that competition between groups is a good thing. So when we talk about this idea of it being a good thing, we believe, well, those in position of power believe that competition is good because it forces people to be creative, to think outside of the box. You know, so what it does is it envisages, which is basically imagined. It imagines the state as a neutral umpire between different groups. And again, I would disagree with that. I don't think that's always necessarily true. It presumes that some groups will win specific debates, but that across the whole field of policymaking, there'll be many different winners. Okay, and it tends to assume that outcomes will depend on the quality of the argument rather than economic power. So what they're saying is, it has nothing to do with money, but in reality, you know, it has everything to do with money. Money is what makes the world go round. I think that's the Earth, Wind, and Fire song. And I'm probably dating myself, which I'm not that old for Earth, Wind, and Fire. I'm probably a little bit younger, but I do remember the songs. And Saturday when my family used to clean, and we used to listen to old music, Motown type music. Anyway, let me get back to the lecture. Theories of the state of elitism tends to argue that competition between different groups distracts from the quality of government. It imagines that government is biased towards certain groups. And you have people like Bernie Sanders who will argue, and even former President Jimmy Carter argues this, says that in the United States, there's biases towards certain groups of people. And we can argue there's biases, men before women in our society. And that's true. Men tend to get more passes in certain things than women. And I know somebody's going to listen to this and say, but but when we talk about power dynamics and structure, men have more power than women in the United States. And that's the United States from the inception was never built on this. It was never built on being, it was never fair. I mean, again, if you look at it, the elites, the Thomas Jeffersons, the James Madisons, the John Adams, these were your elites. And they literally said in the beginning, when they constructed this nation on voting, that you had to be a white male landowner. So if I ask anybody who's listening to this lecture, you might be white, you might even be male, but if you don't own any land, you can't vote. And that was probably about, I would say upwards 85, 90% of the people in the colonies did not own land. So so elitism is as American as an apple pie, I would argue. And we've always been an elite society. And it's not always just based on race. It's not always just based on gender. It can be based on social class. It can be based on education attainment. It's much more nuanced in this country. And it's not so, no pun intended, black and white, okay? It's less concerned with the quality of the argument than with the respective power of the competing groups. Again, this is what elitism says. It's much more nuanced, and I'm just gonna lecture from what the book is saying. I don't always agree with the book, but I'm gonna lecture what the book is saying. Neo-pluralism, democratic elitism, and corporatism. When we talk about neo-pluralists, accept the powerful elites do exist, but that meaningful competition for political influence still exists. So they're saying these two things, it's a dichotomy. These two things are happening when you're neo-pluralism, democratic elitism, and corporatism. If you have a good idea, and let's just say you are the poor person that invented this thing that now everybody's using, and we got to remember too, that is also part of the American. We call it the American dream. The guy from the poor community. A good movie right now that's on Hulu is called Flaming Hot, and by the time Flaming Hot is about a guy who was a Mexican American who was a janitor who worked at Frito-Lay, and you know, he had an idea with the Flaming Hot, with the Cheeto, right? And he was saying, in our community, you guys don't know how to brand your products towards the Hispanic community, because in our community, we like things a little different. And so you're not tapping into this this area, and we call it it's called in business, there's this thing called red ocean and blue ocean. Red ocean is where you have the industry, the potato chip industry. Everybody's doing it. May it be Frito-Lay or Ruffles, right? Everybody's doing it. But then you have this area we call blue ocean. In the blue ocean area, what you have is you have an untapped market that nobody is even thinking about. And when they started the Flaming Hot, what they didn't even realize is how it was going to cross over, right? Cross over, because a lot of times what we tend to think that people are like, even with music, oh, Beyonce would be, or Whitney Houston, let's go back to the 80s. In the 80s, when Whitney Houston first came out, they thought she was going to be what they call a quote unquote a soul singer. They didn't realize she was going to cross over like Michael Jackson. So same thing with Flaming Hot. Not only did they not tap into the Hispanic community, but they didn't tap into a lot of the American society with this new product. Now, every store has Flaming Hot Cheetos, and they probably sell better. Over $1 billion industry for one potato chip. So, I mean, this does happen. I believe in America, two things can be, it can be two things at once. Two things can be happening at one time. In America, few things can be happening at one time, right? Democratic elitism accepts democratic competition, but sees this as a battle between elites. Corporatist accepts that certain groups are bound to prevail, and that the task of the government is to devise policies after consultation between those powerful groups. So we call that lobbying, right? So in our system, you will have powerful groups that go to Washington, D.C., that go to Sacramento, that lobby our politicians. In the community college system, we send students to lobby I think every year. Different schools will send their student governments and other students from student organizations on campus to Sacramento to lobby the state assembly to pass laws that benefit colleges, not just community college, but universities and the Cal State system that benefits you guys as students. So even you guys can be a strong lobbying group. Theories of the state, Marxism. Marxism is a little different. We know Karl Marx, right? Marxism's view on the state is that it only manages affairs in the interests of the bourgeoisie, the owner class, the wealthy, right? The proletariat, therefore, should not support it. That's what he argued. The proletariat, the working class, should not support the owners. The owners are going to always be out for themselves and the profit, they don't care about you, the worker. That's what Marxism is. It's this antagonism between the two forces, that only the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But it can only overcome in a classless society. So he's arguing, get rid of classes, make society classless. You don't need a 1% and everybody else. How about if everybody's the same? That's the problem with that. And I argue the problem, we saw this in the Soviet Union, we see it in the concept of Marxism that China and the Soviet Union and all those former communist countries did not follow was. In Marxism, the leader of the country and the janitor should live in the same type of place, domicile. The leader of the country should have 3 beds. If the leader of the country has 4 rooms where he lives, so should the janitor. The reality is that doesn't happen. Somebody has to live at the Kremlin, and somebody's going to live in a one-room apartment down the street in Moscow. Well, everybody wasn't a classless society. It was not, and China is definitely not. China has the second numbers of billionaires after the United States in the world. You already know that's not a society that's classless. You already know that's a society that has a class system. But also, and I want to make sure you guys understand, politically speaking, China is it's a one-party state. It's under the guise of Marxism. But when we talk about it in the economically, it's pretty capitalist. It's socialism and capitalism hodgepodge together, because the China couldn't keep itself going if it didn't have private businesses, private corporations. And remember what I said earlier, all of those owners of those businesses are members of the Communist Party. If they left the party, let me tell you, they would not have all that wealth. The state will take it and absorb it. And we see it in Russia, those who come up against Putin. And right now, Russia is not a communist state anymore. Putin doesn't want Russia to be a communist state. Putin wants to push Russia back to the time of the czars, the czars were kings, and where he would be the king. It's so funny when I hear people say, I want to take us back to this time when we were glorious, and but there always has to be one leader. And let me guess, Putin is going to be the leader, the one leader. When we talk about the new right theorists argue that the effect of competition between interest groups tends to be an overextension of the state's roles. So what they're saying is, if the state is no longer seen as a source of benefits by competing groups, politicians will no longer be tempted to offer bribes to the electorate. So a lot of times when your people are running, no matter who it is who's running, Gavin Newsom, whoever, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, they always make promises. In fact, they'll make promises such as they'll speak before an interest group, and they'll say, and if it's a conservative group, let's just say a religious conservative group, they'll sit there and make promises like, I'm going to pass a federal abortion law to ban abortions across the entire United States. I don't know if that will get someone elected now, because according to the data, women and young people are, because conservatives are pushing banning abortions nationwide, young people, especially young people, are voting more, and women who have historically, and usually they tend to be white middle class women, are now voting for the more liberal politicians because of the issue of rights to their bodies and making those choices. And so it's very important to understand politicians, when they speak, they know their audience. So they will tell you one thing. And then I went to one where I can't even remember who it was now. I've been to so many of these political things, but I went to one event where they went to, and it was a white politician, went to the Black church and said all those wonderful things the Black church wanted to hear, and talked about criminal justice and a whole lot of different things. Went to the police union like a day or two later and said almost something totally different than he said at the Black church. So a lot of times politicians will try to bribe and say things you want to hear. I tell people, look at the record, because when somebody's telling you, especially when they had a chance to do the things that they're saying they want to do now, and they didn't do it the first time, why didn't you do it the first time? And that's what everybody should be asking those politicians. Next up, we're going to talk about social contract theory. When we talk about social contract theory, it attempts to explain the origins of government. It's associated with with thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke in the 17th century, John Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, and John Rawls in the 20th century. Now, just so you know, I'm not going to be focused on John Rawls because he came later, and I want to just focus on the what I like to call the big three in political science. Depends crucially on different views of human nature and how we see human nature. If you look at the model here, you can see that according to Hobbes, he says man is evil. Locke says man is good. Rousseau says man is good, so society is screwed up. Okay. Hobbes argues that government is needed to protect the public. Locke says it's wanted to benefit the public. Rousseau says it's needed to enforce the social contract. And then I'm just gonna read the next two. Government should be all powerful, cannot overthrow. This is what Hobbes argues. Locke says it should be conventional and can be overthrown. Rousseau says it should be arbitrary and can overthrow. And then Hobbes says power should be not shared. Executive is absolute, so monarch, strong absolute monarch, like in Saudi Arabia, not in the United Kingdom. Locke argues that power should be shared, legislative and executive branch. This is why that Jefferson said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He stole from Locke, who said life, liberty, and property, because Locke was a big proponent of property. He understood that wealth was based on really owning property. And Rousseau says it should be shared and direct, reps not needed. So he's arguing that it should be, our democracy should be a direct democracy. We don't need people to go to Washington or Sacramento or City Hall. We can, anytime there's something that needs to be voted on, they get together, then they have an election on whatever this thing, and we all vote on it. I tend to disagree with Rousseau because it'd be kind of like a mob rule mentality. So Locke tends to be the guy more moderate, I would say. And I know sometimes, especially in this political atmosphere, we don't like talking about moderates. You got to be one extreme or the other. And there's something to be said about moderates. Also, we're going to talk about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was popularized by English theorist Jeremy Bentham. But he asserts that government should ensure the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers. Okay, so government should ensure the greatest happiness to the most amount of people. But he also gives a concern for the rights of minorities. And when we're saying minorities, minority is not always people based on their skin color. It can be based on other factors, gender, sexual orientation, religion, so on and so forth. Okay. Then we're going to move on to liberalism and communitarianism. When we talk about communitarianism, liberalism often assumes a neutral state. It envisions a society of free, competitive individuals for whom social and cultural ties are relatively unimportant. Communitarianism emphasizes the social and cultural context in which individuals live. On this view, it is difficult to envision the state as neutral. So if you understand, when we talk about communitarianism, or just look at the word commune, it's people coming together. We work together, we build together, but a lot of people can't do that. Shoot, some people can't even live with their own relatives, right? We're going to look at anarchism. Anarchists believe that organized state can only be corrupting influence of society. So anarchists, people tend to associate anarchism with violence. It is not a form of violence. It is based on an optimistic view of human nature, which people can live peacefully and settle their differences without needing outside intervention. Okay. Anarchists don't believe that we should go burn everything down. No, that's not. Now that can be a form of anarchism, but there's always going to be forms of everything. Feminism is not burning. Really, the most basic definition of feminism is women are equal to men. That's it. All this other stuff has been used by public relation firms on Madison Avenue to distract you from pushing for more equitable policies to make women more equal to men in our society. The contemporary state, which we're talking about today, is endangered by globalizations because governments worldwide find it more difficult to carry out their traditional functions and their traditional values. The world is smaller now. TikTok, so technology has made the world smaller. I was watching TikTok the other day, and these two girls were walking down the street in Damascus, and they were just talking about how peaceful it was in Damascus. Now, I was thinking, Damascus was in the middle of a civil war a couple of years ago, and the place is half destroyed. No, they were walking around showing how they have a version of Starbucks and how the coffee was a 10 out of 10. Their English was great. And they were two young girls there. They didn't have a hijab on. They were walking down the street laughing and enjoying themselves, and nobody bothered them. So sometimes we tend to hear things, and so our other people will see things, and they're like, I want what they have. I want the freedoms that the American youth have. In many countries, government has been replaced by governance. Instead of issuing commands, the state has to strike bargains with other powerful players at home and abroad. Okay, so be aware of this. The role of government and it's always changing. The state, the rules, our norms will always change. And there's times that people push back against the change, but no matter what you do, once you let Pandora out of a box, you can't put Pandora back in the box. It's just not going to work. Okay. I want to thank you for listening to the lecture today. I will look forward to talking to you guys all next week. And that is the lecture for today. Have a great week. Thank you. Take care, and bye-bye.